We're now live on YouTube with the December 18th meeting of the Node.js modules team. I'm joined by 7 other individuals, and we have a pretty full agenda. So let's jump right into it. The first item we have on the agenda is conditional exports using naming usability discussion. Guy, do you want to pick that one up since it's your pull request?
Sure, I can try to give a very brief description in the name of keeping the time boxes to a minimum here today as well. So we've had a lot of discussion around named exports and the conditional exports proposal, and we've been ironing out the usability on these cases, trying to get as much feedback as possible and share it with as many people as possible. And through various discussions, I think it's probably best to merge this discussion in with the next two items on the agenda, which are implementing logical conditional exports ordering and stabilizing the resolver, and potentially even the self-resolve issue as well, since they all kind of fall under the same area.
Okay, so just to clarify, you're saying you want to merge conditional exports, naming, logical conditional ordering, stabilizing the resolver, and unflagging both conditionals and self into one agenda item?
Maybe let's have a separate one for the unflagging, and let's just discuss the features now and then come back to the unflagging discussion.
Okay, let's try to stick then. Do you think that 10 minutes or 15 minutes would be adequate for those?
Yeah, let's try and keep it within 15 minutes, definitely.
Okay, I'll update the agenda accordingly and just get us started. Let's try to stick to 15 minutes. That's what we originally had timed for all of those items.
Perfect. Okay. Then I will move on to the logical conditional exports ordering feature, which is the PR up on Node.js 31008. And currently the way that that exports match is that the resolver has this kind of hidden priority list. So in the resolver itself, it knows that it's always going to match the node condition before the require or import condition. It's always going to match the default condition last. And so if a user defines their exports and they have the default at the very top and then an import underneath, it doesn't matter. And that's originally the sort of pattern we had with default and require, where it didn't matter which order, it'll always work. Now that we have require and import, which are both on the same footing from a priority perspective, and they're perfectly mutually exclusive. So default isn't mutually exclusive with require, which is why this ordering mattered so much. Now that we have mutually exclusive items, when we look at the scaling of exports conditions, so for example, if you want to add a production condition or allow users to add their own conditions, or if build tools want to add their own conditions, as this list of names grows, and as we started to flesh out some cases around that, it becomes clear that it starts to get a little bit confusing what matches in what order. So if I have like browser, production, Electron, Node, ES 2019, and all these conditions, say if you're an Electron and you're going to match 4 of those conditions, you have no idea which one is going to be matched because they all correspond to your environment potentially. And there's this invisible priority order in the resolver itself. And if you don't know what that is, then you have no clue what it's going to match. So the idea was, instead of relying on this kind of resolver implementation, we can bring that control directly to the users by using the well-defined object order that we can rely on now in JavaScript as of ES 2015, as it was. So if something comes first in the list, it'll match it if it's a valid condition. And if it doesn't, it'll move on to the next item in the list. And the other thing that this PR does is it allows falling back. So if the match corresponds to an invalid target, so you have like the match and then colon and you have an empty array or something, it'll then try the next match in the list. It won't just fail and say, oh, I matched this thing that's invalid. We're now going to throw your entire resolution because this item that came first in the priority order is not a valid target. And that allows some nicer chaining. So basically, Tobias had a very, very nice example of, you can now think of it like if statements. So you can imagine that it's like if condition try thing, and if the thing is invalid, it'll move on to the next condition. And there's a fall through that happens now as well. And as a programmer who's used to writing lots of if statements, I mean, of course, we don't want to encourage lots of if statements in our code as a general rule, but as this kind of logic is naturally branching, for it to naturally match the same semantics of branch conditionals seems quite nice. So that's the overall structure, and I'll stop there because I'm probably already hitting time. So the next thing we can talk about is stabilizing the resolver and the self-resolve, but maybe let's just discuss this a little bit first.
So if I recall, oh, Brad's got his hand up, then I'll go next.
Sure. So I noted on the issue that JSON doesn't actually assert a specific ordering. I've been trying to look into a variety of potential concerns we've had, well, I've had in the past with this. I'm particularly concerned that there are a variety of package utilities out there that sort your package JSON automatically by, well, they sort the keys alphabetically, basically. And so that is something we need to be aware of. Also, other languages, a lot of the very popular marshalling libraries for C# and Java do object ordering based upon the target class, not based upon the ordering inside of JSON itself. I don't know if this is really something we need to block on, but in particular, the fact that we have package JSON utilities that are automatically sorting alphabetically means we should probably take a look and see if anybody big is doing that. So that's it.
So I'll go quickly and then Jan. The big thing for the ordering that I saw in the thread was that any keys that have numbers could significantly cause issues with ordering. So I think one of the things that was discussed there was just, not allowing keys that start with numbers. Seems like a reasonable-ish condition, but just want to throw that out there to the group that would be one of the limitations of doing this form of ordering. Jan, to you.
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify that in Java, since this is a key value data structure and not really a set of fields, Jackson's, or the most popular Java parser, actually preserves key order. Like when you just have a map, it will convert it into a structure that preserves the insertion order.
Thanks, Jan. So I guess overall, is there anyone else who has anything else to add at this moment about the ordering? Does anyone have any objections to changing the resolution algorithm to follow the ordering as structured in the object? Brad, you have your hand up?
I just want to hold off until we can get some research to make sure no tools are sorting it in a very large way. I have no objection to the behavior.
Okay.
I don't know how to raise my hand on this, but if I could just add one thing. I agree with Brad on that. I feel like they're probably not going to sort in the child keys. So that would be what I would be curious to see if anyone does that research. The other thing I was just thinking about was even if the oddball tool here or there or library does reorder them or whatever. I guess the question is whether that would be preferable to, like, you know, this current magic order that is defined in the resolver, because, like, you know, like if there is some library like C# or whatever where it doesn't preserve the order, then it's really no different than what it is now, where in that C# environment you have to like re-implement the, like, you know, the logic of whatever order our resolver wants to pull them in. So, you know, it's not really any, like, I don't think this makes things any worse, even for the environments where like the order is lost or not preserved, you know.
Brad, do you still have your hand up, or is that from
I
before?
just re-raised it. So with my concern with the sorting, if we do find something problematic about sorting, I also think one thing we could imagine doing, we're basically just trying to specify an order here. We could just say it's alphabetically sorted if it's problematic. It wouldn't be in the order of your package.json source text, but at least it would be a reliable order so people could reliably figure out things. So I think it might not harm other environments, this current behavior, but if tools are relying on ordering being alphabetizable, we could have problems. So that's it.
Okay, just before we continue, just as a time check, we are almost at the end of the 15 minutes already, and we haven't really discussed the usability discussion nor the stabilizing discussion. So just before others chime in, just adding that. Salah?
Yeah, so JSON, the nice thing is it's a string. So if you want to implement some sort of a small patch to basically run the string and determine the order after you use whatever parsing library you're using elsewhere. So I think there are easy ways to rely on the string to close that gap in these tools. That's it. Thanks.
Thanks, Salah. Okay. Brad, do you want to pick back up where you left off?
You mean Guy?
Yeah, I meant Guy. Thank you, Brad.
Okay, so yeah, I mean, these are the two things that I feel are kind of the outstanding usability changes that I would like to make before shipping exports and self-resolve. The other one on self-resolve is we had a couple of bugs. It's a PR to fix those bugs. This is 31009. And in addition to fixing the two bugs, it also hits up across this compatibility concern between ES modules and CommonJS when it comes to the self-resolve. And the argument for this is the following. If we add package name resolution to CommonJS, that is theoretically a breaking change because lots of packages can have a Node modules folder, or lots of users already use Node today can have a Node modules folder with the name of their package in that Node modules folder. And maybe they're running like the current stable version against the development version that way. There's various patterns like that. If we just ship the self-resolve that then intercepts that Node modules lookup and instead says, no, if you're importing your own name, you're going to get your own package, then we could potentially, that's a major change, and we could potentially breaking CommonJS resolver semantics. For that reason, when Jan implemented the self-resolve PR, he made sure that this applies after doing the Node modules lookup. So it'll do all your Node modules checks and see if that package exists in Node modules all the way up the file system. And only when it's going to get to the point where it'll say, we didn't find this require for the name of your package, now we're going to use the package that has that name, the self-resolve. And my concern with having that same behavior implemented for ES modules is it's taking a legacy compatibility concern and pushing it forward into the indefinite future. And ideally, I think it would be nicer to have a better encapsulation for self-resolve where you can know if there's a name required, it will always, as a rule, there's no exceptions, it will always load the local package. And for that to be, but if there's something in Node module somewhere up on the file system that can override it, I feel there's a weaker feature and will introduce friction into tooling workflows. So this PR tries to make them work differently, and it says CommonJS will have the compatibility behavior, ES modules will have the guaranteed encapsulated behavior.
Jan, and then I've got something to add.
A quick comment on that front. So one other thing that we had in the past as a problem of self-resolve was the potential import map bloat, where every single package needs to defensively declare all the exports also in the scope of the package itself. We had discussed having some sort of opt-in in the package.json, whether it's the exports field or new field, that says, hey, I do want to have self-resolve, which would enable the feature, but also would make it most likely safe to, for both CommonJS and ESM, have this check first before node modules are searched.
So a thought that I have on this personally, like we did do a bunch of work to make the resolving algorithm between CommonJS and ESM identical, and this feels not in line with that. I know that we had discussed introducing a sigil, and a sigil seems like a good shorthand to say, hey, load me first, especially if it's a sigil that can't be used anywhere else. A sigil is also one of those things that could be an additive change in the future, so we don't even really need to land on consensus around what that is today to move things forward. So I just want to express that I'm personally uncomfortable with changing the order here between ESM and Common. Guy?
So as Jan just commented, one of the major benefits of using the package name is that this name field is the same name as the published name as the package, which means that if you're in like a monorepo and you know that all the other packages that require this package are also going to require it by the same name, then your import map system can dedupe that that import map and share it between all the other packages. So you only have one entry for this whole package, and that works because the names line up. So that because the package itself will call itself by its own name, and then monorepo can all have that same consistency. So that is a huge benefit here to not using a sigil. As soon as we go down the sigil path, we get that.
To be clear, I'm not saying we should get rid of the name. I'm saying we should keep the self-reference via the name of the module, but it should be the last one that's resolved. And if we want a character that can be used to shortcut and ensure that it's the first thing that's resolved, we should pick a mechanism that can be used the same in both loaders. So that's saying, like, keep the name, have the name be the last thing that's resolved, which is what we're doing right now, and then in turn introduce a sigil, which can be the first thing that's loaded, so that if people want to protect against that case, they can do so defensively. Corey, you have your hand up, and then I'm going to set, we really need to kind of wrap this up probably in 5 minutes if we want to leave room for the other things on the agenda. And if we have time, we can come back to this.
So my comment is about, I'm sorry if I misunderstood. It sounded like somebody said to resolve the package name in node modules if it was there, but then fall back on self-resolve. If that's correct, then a concern there is what happens if another transitive dependency installs a different version of the self package. And basically, if npm's deduplication causes a different copy to unexpectedly find its way there. just wanted to raise that concern.
Jeffrey?
So I liked what Jan had suggested, that like we could treat something in the package.json as a way to opt into this feature. Like say if your package.json, it has to have, say, the exports field with something defined in exports to enable this. And then that, I hope, gets us out of the backward compatibility concerns. But then lets this feature behave the way Guy wants it to, where it behaves the same in CommonJS and ESM. It's at that point, it's just like kind of an educational thing that we have to inform users that if you want this to work, you need to define exports, even if it's just a string that matches your main.
Could this be opt-in where the self-resolve into node modules would only work if you have a direct dependency? I'm not sure if NPM even allows that.
Self-resolve doesn't even hit the node modules at all.
Okay.
It resolves into your own package. Jeff, was there anything else?
No, I mean, it sounded like that could have been a compromise that maybe would have had consensus on that approach.
Okay, let's hear from Guy, and then we can see if we can reach an agreement on this.
Well, let's find out what the consensus is then.
I personally feel more comfortable if we say that self-resolve is something that only turns on when you use exports. And if we did that, then it feels less like a Semver major change and more like a feature, although I'd probably need to spend a little bit more time thinking about it, especially as we backport, because putting things at the end. Yeah, I think that doing it with exports maybe makes it something that's not Semver major, but I need to think about it more. Does anybody else have anything else to add on this particular issue, or should we kick it back to the issue tracker for now? I'm not hearing anything. Okay, so Guy, we talked about we didn't talk about the naming of conditional exports, but does anybody have any concerns with the names that landed, or are people okay with continuing discussion outside of this meeting if we want to make more changes? I hear silence. Silence sounds decent. Ordering, seems like we were all on the same page about ordering, mostly that we need to ban symbols ban keys that start with numbers, and then Brad wanted some more research done on tooling. And then it seems like for the self-referential modules, we still need to maybe have a little bit more discussion on the implementation there. Anything I missed in the summary? And then the only thing that's left is stabilizing the resolver. Guy, was there anything else that we needed to discuss in regards to that?
So as far as my own major priorities for the resolver, I feel like once we've got these things in, that gets us to a good amount of stability. There is still further stability, might include things like refining error messages, validations, and then we do also have the imports feature in the package JSON, which is in Jan's original spec for exports and imports. That is something we could consider as well, or it's something we could consider adding later on as part of the future resolver features. One benefit of self-resolve is it does allow packages to self-resolve conditionals within themselves, because if you can resolve your own exports and your own exports have conditions, you can resolve your own conditions, but they must be public conditions. So imports allows us to have private conditions within the package. Maybe that's important. Maybe it's not. I'm not sure. It's not right now. We're not prioritizing that.
Okay, so let's Wes adds in the comment that loaders are technically a pretty big part of the resolver and its stability. Do people have any particular feelings around that?
Can we put that under the loader discussion? Because I do feel that the resolver is the default resolver, which loaders allow you to change.
Brad, are you okay with punting that into the loaders discussion?
He said almost exactly what I was going to.
Okay, cool, great. So then with that being said, let's move on to the next agenda item. We have 15 minutes for require of ESM. Wes, would you like to present this topic? Wes is asking to defer a few minutes. So let's talk about the unflagging stuff first then, and we can get back to this. So we have unflagging experimental self and unflagging conditional exports, and unflagging on ESM is 3 different issues. Maybe we can get through some of these pretty quickly. I'll start with unflagging on 12 because I want to just propose something, and if people see it as non-controversial, we can just kind of move forward. So the proposal that I'd like to make, which I believe I made in the issue, was that we, assuming this timeline is based on the assumption that conditional exports lands in January. Alternatively, we can change this plan if we have changes to release schedule. But assuming that both conditional exports and named exports land in January, the plan would be to backport everything in January. And I think we could backport everything in January to 12, independent of what decisions we've made. The main thing that's been blocking the backport has been that V8 7.8 has not been on 12 yet. So we would have to unroll a bunch of the refactoring that we did on top of synthetic modules. So instead of doing that, I think it's better just to wait. We have a backport PR for 7.8 that's ready to go as soon as the next Ember patch of 12 goes out. So we would backport 7.8 and then backport basically the whole implementation that would go out in a Semver minor in January, continuing to be behind a flag, with the aim of removing the flag in the subsequent Semver minor, which would happen in April. And we would be able to, because it's behind a flag, continue to update it on a monthly basis and just kind of keep the implementation neck and neck with what's going on 13, just with, tiny bit of delay as we wait for things to land. Does anybody have any concerns with that timeline? Okay, cool.
Also, remind me when 13 is end of life, like really soon, right?
13 is end of life in April.
So
And
that
that's when we
also
cut 14.
So that also means that we have basically until April to make breaking changes to anything in the implementation that could then land not within 13, but could land as 14 or,
We can still land breaking changes at any time to an experimental API.
Well, yeah, but
prior art.
even beyond that, it's even safer because,
Yes, but in general, when we have prior art with HTTP2, APIs that are marked as experimental can receive Semver major changes. We would likely for LTS backport those in a Semver minor rather than a patch, although we could arguably land it in either. Behind a flag, it's very easy to land all these things. When it's not behind a flag, it requires a little bit more discussion. The only thing that we would not be able to do in a backport or even on 13 would be Semver major changes to stable APIs. So if there's any Semver major changes that we want to make, for example, to require, that would have to happen in between 13 and 14.
Okay. Sounds good to me.
Yeah. Cool. So since it seems like we have general consensus on that, I'm willing to take on, you know, at least the first pass of getting those backports together, and then I'll pull people in as I stumble. The next two that we've got here is unflagging conditional exports and unflagging resolve self. I think, hey Wes, how are you doing for time right now? Are you able to talk about require ESM at the moment? Not seeing a response yet because I feel he's still in the bus. Okay, so let's talk about experimental self first, because I feel like conditional exports, or we can even just say, like, I think that if we do not have consensus on moving forward with require ESM by early January, which was around the time that we talked about, that we, you know, should look at unflagging conditional exports. Obviously, that is slightly dependent on the conversation that we're about to have, but especially with the dates that we're looking at for LTS, I would like us to unflag it a week or two before the LTS Semver minor, so we have time to, you know, backport it. Does anyone have any concerns with that as a timeline? Okay, I'm not seeing any concerns. And I'd say similarly for resolve self, obviously we have a couple things that we need to work through on that before it can land that were identified today. But, you know, I think a similar timeline, but potentially earlier if we can reach stability for unflagging resolve self. Does anybody see any concerns with that?
I feel like we should be able to get resolve self wrapped up by the January deadline for sure.
Okay, so with that in mind, I will follow up with the release team and see if we can push out the date of the minor as far as possible. And we should aim for 2 weeks before the minor as kind of like the deadline to land these things. Does that seem reasonable to everyone?
So is that still January 7th, which I think was what we were talking about before, or do you think it's something else?
Well, because of the security release that we just had that delayed 12, the Semver patch hasn't even gone out yet. So I think all of these things are going to get pushed a little bit. So we may have a little bit more time.
More time, but then minus 2 weeks because we need to be 2 weeks prior, or even after January 7th?
So if I look at the schedule right now, give me 1 second. The current release plan for 12 was expecting 12.13.2 to go out yesterday, but it didn't. And then it was expecting the Semver minor to go out on the 21st. So that's where we came up with the date of the 7th. My guess is that both of these dates are going to be pushed out a week, possibly 2. And so, you know, whichever one we do, there's like a release candidate date. And we should likely get things in before then. So it seems like it would be either the 7th or the 14th would be the cutoff date, based on what's decided by the release team.
Okay, just to try to maybe like speak for Wes a little bit before he gets on. I was thinking that this is why I was asking about the deadlines, was that like, so we sort of have 2 deadlines, January and April. Like it doesn't, I think we'd all agree that require VSM doesn't seem likely to land before the January deadline. I guess there's potentially some chance that like all the issues could get worked out by the April deadline. So maybe if it's something that Wes wants to keep pursuing and keep trying to win approval on, then, you know, 4 months is a significant enough length of time to take a crack at it.
I mean, looking at the schedule right now, Jeff, so the next meeting that we would have had would have been on the 1st. Maybe what we need to do is plan an out-of-band meeting for the 8th of January to just see where everything's at and make a decision.
Everything mean all of these features, not just require VSM?
Yes, if we're hoping to get things backported into the LTS release, it seems like January 8th is a prudent date
Okay.
for us to maybe meet and see where things at. Wes is commenting in the chat right now saying that he's working on a simpler variant of it that could be likely to land before January. I'm sure he'll tell us a little bit more about it once we're there. How is everybody on the call right now available at the same time that we usually meet a week early on January 8th?
Or put another way, is anyone not available?
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to set an out-of-band meeting for the 8th. We'll keep our meeting for the 15th. And I'll send out an invite so people have it on their calendar or aren't aware of it. And I'll make sure it's in the Node.js calendar as well. And then I'm not saying punt, we should still be out of band having these discussions and thinking about stuff. Wes, I'll make sure that you and I are in touch, just kind of like keeping pulse of where things are at. And we can, follow up then. Okay, so let's look at the agenda really quickly. Did anyone else have anything else they wanted to talk about for unflagging here? Okay, Wes says they should be able to speak in a second. That's cool. Do we want to take 5 minutes to just get an update on loader hooks, but not go too deeply into them? Is that a reasonable use of time? Brad?
Sure, I can just do a tiny bit of an update. So Jeff introduced a new couple of hooks that we haven't really discussed before. There's a PR on the repo. You should go look at it right now. This is so far being framed as an additive change. We have had discussions previously of doing bigger refactors. I don't think we are aiming to do those currently, but so look at this PR as an additive thing, not blocking a refactor in the future. That's about all that's going on recently. That's it.
Okay. Anyone else have anything else to add on loaders? Jeff, we may actually get through every agenda item. Isn't that wild?
I'll owe
Wes,
you a beer.
how are you doing there? Do you still need a minute or two?
I can speak now. It's just going to be some background noise for a minute or so.
Okay, because we can do 2 minutes on the charter if you want to just wait. But if you're good, let's do it.
Right. So the first PR that I put up was, in my mind, what is the most maximal implementation that could be produced. One that effectively had the highest likely compatibility with like actual code that people would want to write, and allowed all ESM code to execute and function as the ESM author intended. So like, that's what I wanted to start with, because I wanted to then see what technical things people took issue with that, and then only walk back the parts that people actually took issue with. So from what I have gathered from what has been said on the PR, people don't like the fact that require could potentially have event loop turns happening during the execution of require because it looks like a function call. Fair enough, I suppose, even though I think it would be quite nice if it could work. But we don't actually have to do that, simply because we don't have to allow synchronously executing an async module execution. I brought this up in the thread, but like the browser is contemplating banning async modules in service worker contexts for similar reasons, simply because async modules have very strange execution semantics. So simply saying that if your module execution is async, we won't allow it is very acceptable for a CommonJS caller, especially since most modules don't actually need top-level await. And so the simpler version of that PR that I plan on putting up is one where I simply just synchronously unwrap promises if they're resolved, and that's it. And before someone says that breaks the promises spec, I'm going to tell you that top-level await in modules breaks the promise spec, so it's not my fault. That's actually just how top-level await is defined to work.
So Wes, just to make sure that, oh, wait, Guy and then Brad and then me. Guy?
Let Bradley go first, please.
Can you clarify how top level await is breaking that? Because if so, that's a spec bug.
Top-level await, the top-level await specifically doesn't break it. So the way modules are executed breaks it. If you expected that every module execution was a promise to its execution and then joined with .thens, you would expect that you would have event loop turns between the execution of every module. You do not. The reason you do not is because the promises are not actually executed. They're synchronously unwrapped up until the point where you finally actually hit an await, at which point the graph actually becomes async and you actually see an event loop turn. This was a compromise done. This way, all graphs that were currently synchronous stay synchronous. Because believe it or not, people actually take a dependency on things being synchronous.
Can you clarify where
I can respond to that if it's useful. So the top-level await spec executes modules in a synchronous way. There's nothing about the actual execution that is promise-based.
Correct, exactly.
Until you start hitting top-level awaits, and then it turns into a promise execution. But execution, if all your modules in your graph are sync, the execution is a sync execution. There's nothing async about it.
Right, exactly.
It happens to have a promise, but that promise is only there if other async modules need to use it. And could even be refactored to remove that promise so that in the sync case, that promise doesn't even exist. And that is a
precisely
improvement. But specifically on that point, if CommonJS were to load an async module, you only know during the execution process, as we start to process the tree, that we've hit an async module. So you're suggesting that you would like to allow that execution to run to completion, but on the common resolver side, you'd immediately return an exception.
There are two ways that you could go with that I've been thinking of. One of them is there is spec machinery in the WattWG working group that pre-marks an entire graph as containing async because the service workers people need that. And so we could depend on that should it exist, but that's just a way to make it a very early error. Or the other way is to cheat just a little bit and actually just unwrap the promise that joins everything together until you get to the point where a promise is in a pending state and then you stop. And at that point you have two choices. One of them is either choose to return said promise, that way the user can wait on it, or throw. It's kind of pragmatic which one you choose.
The main thing is that for consistency with the ES module resolvers, if later on you import that same module, it shouldn't be stored in a record, or it shouldn't cause a reload or re-execution is the main thing, so that the processing should be fully retained.
Right, and so that's why if you threw, you wouldn't like cancel the execution or anything. You still execute it up to that point, and you're still planning to continue to execute it in the async part. You'd just be throwing the synchronous execution of the containing CommonJS library. And that's why I said the other option is to actually just return a promise from require at that point. Which is, yeah.
Brad, and then I have something to add.
So a lot of this PR's intent was to enable working with existing code that uses the syntax of ES modules, but has a different semantic. So it seems to me like, at least due to the recent development of top level await, it is likely that we could do an early error without trying to do any shenanigans.
Yep.
I still don't understand the breakage claim about synchronous inspection of promises. Maybe we can do that offline. But
I mean, I'm not the one claiming any breakage there. I just saw, I think it was Jan claiming the PR that breaks the promises A star spec. And I say, yes, promises A star spec says JavaScript can't inspect the state of a promise. However, the runtime is not JavaScript and can use promise features beyond the A star spec. It's allowed to do that.
Correct, but that still doesn't affect how modules run. So that is my question on how that relates back to the JavaScript spec and how it synchronously evaluates modules. We can do that offline.
That's mostly just because for API, like ease of working with the API, we'd probably still define it as like returning a promise and working with a promise. That way it has a consistent API shape, and then which then makes unwrapping said promise easier than maintaining dual APIs for a synchronous mode that then fills in the async one if it starts executing async, which you then have to inspect once the synchronous mode is done. I mean, we could do that as well. It's just more complicated.
Sure, I guess. I'm gonna have to look at that still. It sounds like we may have a bug. Anyway, I think that an early error seems likely to me to be non-objectionable and achieve the goal of running people's code that's in the wild. So
Yep, that's the goal, right?
So yeah, that's all I wanted to say.
Yeah, and as I said, like the ideal for like the earliest of early errors is to, as I said, the WG people have a modification of the spec that they've been working on that just enhances the async flag, which currently only applies to a single module, to have an equivalent for a module graph that flags it as whether or not the graph itself contains any module that's async. We can figure that out on our own without it being part of the spec, I believe. We just have to traverse the graph and check the async flag, but yeah.
So
collaboration's good, right?
Yeah, a couple questions that I have here, because I like the direction where this is going, Wes. So failing, I like the idea of failing early, especially I would want it to be broadly to all dynamic modules or all async modules. So like specifically, this would also preclude requiring WebAssembly modules, most likely. But I think like we could just enumerate what the limitations of this would be. But, you know, since I don't think many people are, you know, like importing or requiring WebAssembly modules in the wild and expecting that to just work out of the box in Node, I think that's fine.
And error message in these cases can be brutally clear and honest. It can be like your graph contains module X, which does is either WebAssembly, contains a weight, blah.
Yeah,
please use import. Yeah, please use dynamic import instead of require on this import. Like,
yeah, then
it can be a super clear error in the cases where we need to have an error.
And then the second question, I haven't had a chance to dig into your code. I know earlier implementations involved more than one event loop. Is that still part of the implementation or no?
The one that I posted did not involve more than one event loop. As I said, that one, the PR that I opened, I removed the inner event loop because I decided to go for the most maximal implementation that made an ES module and any async await inside of that at the top level behave as the ES module would expect. Technically, it breaks concerns for CommonJS callers, which is why just not handling top level await is actually much better for CommonJS consumers. And so if you're worried about preserving expected behavior of require for CommonJS consumers, even if they require exotic things like ESM or WASM, then just throwing if exotic things happen is the safer thing to do.
Yeah, the nice thing there too is throwing early leaves a design space open for us to solve things later in a way we haven't thought of yet.
Correct, it does.
Guy, to you.
Yeah, so just to mention the other concern about this process is all our loader hooks are async. So unwrapping the promises also means wrapping the loader hook promises. Where
related, I was Bradley mentioned this in the thread. The design space that we wanted to move loader hooks to is moving them off of the main realm because there are a bunch of security concerns with loaders executing in the main realm. And so the way that we wanted to consider doing that was by shuffling objects back and forth between loaders in a shared buffer and using atomics.wait to wait on the messages between them, which is, of course, synchronous. And by doing that, you no longer need an async resolver API.
Right.
Because
but in such an API, every single resolve and source and translate operation must be fully blocking down to that communication. So we need to make sure that the performance works out. CommonJS is, of course, synchronous, and the performance is what it is. But it's something to bear in mind that if we wanted, for example, HTTP loaders, the entire thread would be blocked while fetching the resource.
Even if we are calling atomics.wait, we can actually wait on a lock that is only toggled once all resources requested are complete from all of their loader pipelines, the synchronous equivalent of a promise.all.
It requires a redesign to the loaders API to support, because you effectively have to shim in an async API, because you won't.
It requires some redesigns to the internals.
The blocking as well, in general loaders, like while something's fetching, your app will normally continue to run and you'll be able to do things. Under this model, the entire application goes to sleep while you're doing an HTTP fetch. So
loaders have to execute before the module graph loads. So I'm not sure that's the case.
Right, but modules load all the time with dynamic import. They're a runtime construct. It basically means that we are pausing the entire thread for anything like that, unless we allow this required to have semantics and not support asynchronous loaders or something like that.
I mean, yeah, that is obviously the other option. You can throw a similar error if you encounter an async custom loader as well. I'd much rather try and make it so that custom loaders can be like sync if possible, simply because running them like off thread and then waiting on them, like it. The idea of having loaders that can execute interleaved with your program is scary to me, from like just figuring out what the order of operations is. But again, it does become obvious that there is a way forward with that in either, like with either choice you go with. If you choose to either throw, if you include a loader that actually requires an async operation because, you know, it uses an async API, or if we make it so that all the loaders are executed off thread and we're capable of synchronously waiting on them. And like the third option there is also designing the API such that all the loaders have async APIs and we execute them off realm. And then we have an adapter in front of that that allows us to access them synchronously if we need to use a synchronous entry point, because e.g. we are being called from required.
Sorry to interrupt. A quick point of order. We've got 1 minute left and we've got to wrap this up. This sounds like a really positive development. I think we should kick back to the issue to talk through technical bits. We could also consider running another out-of-band meeting to discuss this particular topic. I'm about to get kicked out of this meeting room, so we're going to have to wrap everything up. So thank you, everyone, for joining today. And Wes, thank you for all the hard work on this. I know it's not been an easy path to get to where you're at.
And if you ever get the opportunity, please add more doc comments to the Node source code. Thank you.